Welcome to AP Euro for Winners.
Today, we are continuing Unit 4 and talking about the Enlightenment, which, as mentioned in the last video, is also part of the Age of Reason with the Scientific Revolution. Let's get into some context before we actually dive into the Enlightenment. So, what's going on in the world leading up to this? Well, there's going to be a reaction to absolutist forms of government across much of Europe. People are starting to not like the divine right monarchies and how much centralized power they have, and the fact that there's usually at this time with state religions. So opinions are going to start coming about of like, I don't know if I like this. I don't really have any say in what's going on in my life. And then, as we covered last lesson, the scientific revolution, people were questioning the church and what the church was saying, right? Which at this time was kind of number one in society. Government was kind of number two in terms of power-ish. So you have to question the church, and now people are like, all right, well, what else about my life do I want to see? So these are going to be application of principles from the scientific revolution to now society and human institutions, not necessarily space and our position in it. Then we also have the mercantilist societies, which we've gone over a lot up until now. But again, this is kind of moving from mercantilist societies towards market economy, and we'll see that it takes that next step further in the Enlightenment. And then lastly, the roles of women are pretty traditional. We've seen some people try to contest that, but really the general consensus is that women's place belongs in the home.
So let's get a definition for the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment is a European intellectual movement that emerges in the 17th and 18th century, so the 16th and 1700s. Okay, and this is a creation of a new group of thinkers who are referred to as philosophes. Okay, this is a fancy French word for philosophers. Okay, because the Enlightenment starts out in France. Most of these philosophes are middle class, highly educated, and they traditionally did not have a lot of representation or say in the government. And so they demand more representation in the government. Okay. And so here is the basics of Enlightenment thought. We want to get our knowledge from the classics. So again, you can think of this as kind of like the Renaissance and that same idea where we're calling back to the Greeks and the Romans. We are skeptical. Okay. So what that means is we don't think everything that's been said already is necessarily true, and some knowledge might be impossible to gain. We believe in human reason, so humans have the capacity to think for themselves in a rational manner. And so, what does rational mean? So, rationalism is the basis for knowledge. I should say reason is the basis for knowledge rather than experience. Okay. And then lastly, empiricism is another idea where knowledge is gained through our senses. Okay, so like observation and experimentation. You can think back to how we described that in the scientific method with how they were reasoning. Okay, so these are the kind of the different ways that Enlightenment thinkers are trying to view the world around them.
So let's look at new enlightened worldviews on religion. So religion at this time is going to become more private for people. People started to keep their views more to themselves and they reflect on their religion, which would lead to their own individual beliefs, not necessarily agreeing with everything they were told. They have their own kind of spin on what they believe. And then we have new philosophies on religion coming about. So, for example, this idea of religious tolerance is really going to be promoted by a guy named Voltaire in his book called The Treatise of Tolerance in 1763. So again, with the printing press, we have this ability for people to read this and, agree with the fact that multiple religions should be tolerated. We also have two important concepts here, deism and atheism. We briefly mentioned deism in the last one, but again, it's the divine creator doesn't really interfere with natural law, right? Kind of going back to Newton, but more viewing God as a clockmaker. This is going to emphasize human reason and morality. Well, and then we have atheism, which kind of go hand in hand a little bit, that the world is better explained by science and not necessarily based on a God. So a little bit less of a clockmaker there, so a little slight difference. But this is going to be really promoted, both of these concepts actually, but atheism in particularly is promoted by a guy named Denis Diderot. So he's going to publish a collection of works called the Encyclopedia, and this is pretty much putting together a bunch of different Enlightenment thinkers' works so that everyone else can kind of read them, and they're in smaller portions, not necessarily big books by each person, but like little excerpts of each people. So again, all promoting religious tolerance, and then these concepts of deism and atheism.
So more talking about the enlightened worldviews on religion, they're going to there's going to be some attempts to counteract religious enlightenment thought, and one of them is German pietism or pietism. So this is a Protestant revival movement in the early 1700s. So we know what Protestants are, but this is in Germany, okay? And it's going to emphasize a warm and emotional religion, calling back to some ideas from Protestantism like a priesthood of all believers and the power of Christian rebirth in everyday affairs. So this is going to try to encourage Protestantism within these new enlightened ideas. So it's trying to get, because a lot of enlightened thinkers are kind of moving away from religion, right? So this is a concept to know, so we see how Protestants are trying to make Enlightenment thought work with their religion so that there's still some followers.
Let's switch gears and look at politics and how the Enlightenment changed politics. So people are going to start to really challenge divine right monarchies. This is going to lead to this natural law and natural rights concept, which is promoted by John Locke, which pretty much state that people should have the right to life, liberty, pursuit of property, and resistance to oppression. That's going to become a big one. And then also this idea that society is driven by self-interest, right? People having a voice in the government, which is going to lead to social contract theory. This is important. It's in red. College Board loves this. The social contract theory is the state originates, the state as in the government, originates with the consent of the governed, right? If there weren't the governed, the people, there would be no government. So there's got a hand-in-hand relationship there. These concepts are going to be promoted through John Locke's book, Second Treatise on Civil Government in 1690, and then Jean-Jacques Rousseau's The Social Contract in 1763.
And a lot of those books are going to even be used to like influence the American Revolution, but also like the French Revolution and a lot of other like political thoughts. So, continuing on with politics and how we're challenging divine right and absolute monarchs, we have the idea that political institutions should reflect the social aspects of each community. So, there's this guy, Montesquieu, and he writes this book called The Spirit of Laws, which talks about the separation of powers and the preservation of civil liberties. So if you think separation of powers, you can think, in the American government, the three branches of government. That's directly created because of Montesquieu's ideas. Or you could think England and how we have the parliament and the monarch, okay, separating our powers. And then preserving civil liberties is just the freedoms that people should have from their government. And then another way they're challenging these violent monarchies is that punishment should only be severe enough to achieve the proper purpose of security and order. So your punishment shouldn't fit the crime. Okay, so anything that's too much punishment is tyranny. And Cesar Beccaria writes about this in his book On Crimes and Punishment. Again, about making sure that we have just punishments for crimes.
And we know we're throwing a lot of books and titles your way. And if you don't memorize those, that's okay. But you do need to memorize these people with their kind of core beliefs. Let's move on to the economy. So, as we mentioned with the context, the enlightened thinkers are going to challenge mercantilism. And they're going to have this laissez-faire idea of hands-off economy, which argues for less or no government regulation, right? It's going to push for free trade and free markets. This is kind of the extension that we talked about a while ago with mercantilism going to free market economy and then going to capitalism, as we'll see. So Adam Smith, we've talked about this guy before. Wealth of Nations is his book. It's a stepping stone to capitalism, and it argues that the only thing the state should do, state as in the government, is pay attention to protecting its citizens, as it should stay out of economic affairs, right? The economy should be driven by supply and demand, which come from the people. And that's how he says it's this invisible hand, right? It's the supply and demand driving the economy. It's invisible force, invisible hand, not necessarily government regulation. So really important idea here. And this gives people more involvement and more say in the economy as well.
Continuing on with our economy focus, Francois Quesnay founds a school of thought called the physiocrats. All right, so this is a new vocab term. The physiocrats are going to argue that labor and commerce should be freed of all restraint, so that, again, nations should not regulate anything. This is very similar to Adam Smith, The Wealth of Nations, or laissez-faire economics. Okay, so one famous physiocrat is Anne Robert Jacques Turgot, and he's an administrative assistant under King Louis the 15th and the 16th, and he tries to reform some of their economic policies by trying to make taxes more equitable, spending the taxes on infrastructure and roads, paying people fair wages and instead of forcing people into labor. Now, he's dismissed in 1776 from his position, but again, the idea matters, right? That he's trying to get people to be paid a fair wage and make everything more equitable. And this goes along again with all these enlightened ideas of the economy and with the physiocrats.
And hopefully you're seeing the ties of the context to what topics that we're talking about and how they're changing. So lastly, we have the women, right? New enlightened views on women. So enlightened thinkers are going to challenge the social construct of women's roles. As we talked traditionally, women were kind of meant to be in the house, quote unquote. But there's new ideas of equality are going to be emerging, mostly from women in positions of status, right? So we're going to see those upper class ones that actually have status and power to speak of. So you can kind of see that a lot of people are not going to be represented in these upper class women. But things like women's rights, access to education, they're going to be starting to read more than just novels, thanks to the printing press, and kind of develop their own views on marriage, less about what tradition says. And they're going to start talking. A really famous, kind of enlightened person on women's rights is Mary Wollstonecraft. And in her book, she's a Vindication on the Rights of Women. She's going to argue that women are irrational only because they haven't taught how to be rational through education. If we educate women, women will be rational and they will be equal members of society. And then these women, right, that are reading and kind of getting their voice out are going to begin hosting salons. And these are social gatherings put on by women of higher social standing. If we can kind of see the picture here, we're going to see these white upper class women. And they're kind of like book clubs of philosophy, right? They're discussions and promotions of Enlightenment views. Which ones do they like? Which ones do they not like? They're kind of similar to coffee houses or academias or, lending libraries. This is going to broaden the audience for new ideas. Not that they're going to reach the middle to lower classes necessarily, but there's going to be more people going to be able to talk about things. And in this image on the right, this is called the first reading at Madame Geoffrin's Voltaire's Tragedy. Let's just insert those words because I'm not even going to bother trying. But again, look at the people. Look at the salon that's being shown here. This is in reaction to Voltaire and them reading Voltaire. So
Men and women learning together.
Yep.
Last point here about women is that a lot of philosophers are going to argue to keep women excluded still. Okay, so it's not like everyone's jumping on this bandwagon. Rousseau writes this book called Emile, called The Treatise of Education, and argues that boys and girls are educated in order to prepare them for their future. Okay, boys should have swords, girls should have dolls, and that the role of women is to support men. So we see how Jean-Jacques Rousseau, even though he's an Enlightenment thinker, is not being very enlightened on the role of women. And then in response to that, Mary Wollstonecraft and Marquis de Condorcet argue against Rousseau. Wollstonecraft talks about, again, how women need to be educated to become rational. Like maybe they're irrational right now, but it's because they haven't been educated. And Condorcet is very pro women's equality, pro women's suffrage, which means the right to vote. He's very ahead of his time. So yeah.
I know we botched a lot of the names, but we tried. Here are the historical developments that College Board wants you to know. There are a lot of them, so please read through them. And as always, thank you for watching. Shout out to our AP Euro kids. See you all in the thrilling next video about 18th century society and demographics. Ooh. Until then,
bye.